December 23, 1941, just after 2 in the morning. On a strip of coral barely 4 miles long, a Marine Corps pilot named Henry Elrod is out of airplanes, nearly out of ammunition, and almost out of time. 6 days ago, he was flying. Tonight, he's fighting on foot, in the dark, alongside sailors and construction workers who have never fired a weapon at another human being in their lives. Somewhere in the smoke behind him, 449 United States Marines are doing exactly what he is doing, holding a piece of American territory against the full weight of the Imperial Japanese Navy, with no reinforcements coming and no way off the island. In a few hours, most of them will be prisoners of war. But for 16 days, this tiny, forgotten outpost did something almost nothing else in the Pacific managed to do in December of 1941. It held. This is the story of how and why it mattered. Wake Island is not really an island. It's an atoll, 3 narrow strips of coral, wake, Wilkes, and Peel, wrapped around a shallow lagoon in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles west of Hawaii and 600 miles from Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. Nobody lived there. There was no fresh water, no soil to speak of, nothing but sand, scrub, and rats. And yet, by 1941, American war planners considered it one of the most important pieces of real estate in the Pacific, a refueling stop for Pan American's China Clipper flying boats, and, increasingly, a forward base that could give early warning of a Japanese attack and serve as a stepping stone between Hawaii and the Philippines. Whoever held Wake held a piece of the map that both sides badly wanted. Construction began in January 1941. By December, more than 1,000 civilian contractors from the Morrison-Knudsen Company were living on the atoll, building an airstrip, barracks, and gun emplacements. The military garrison sent to protect them was small by design, and smaller still in practice. The 1st Marine Defense Battalion, under Major James P. S. Devereux, numbered 449 officers and men, roughly a third of what military planners had actually calculated the island needed. They had 6 5-inch coastal guns pulled from decommissioned battleships, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and a scattering of machine guns, but no radar, no barbed wire in some sectors, and not enough men to fully crew half of what they had. On November 28th, Navy Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham arrived to take overall command of the newly designated Naval Air Station. He had 10 days to learn the island before the war found it. The last piece of the puzzle arrived even later. On December 4th, 4 days before the attack, 12F 4F-3, Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 211 landed on Wake's unfinished airstrip, led by Major Paul Putnam. The pilots and ground crews had trained on older biplanes. Nobody had packed the instruction manuals for the new aircraft. There were almost no spare parts. If a Wildcat took damage, there was a real chance it would never fly again, not because the plane couldn't be fixed, but because there was nothing on the island to fix it with. Devereux himself was not a popular man before the war started. He drove his Marines 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, chipping gun emplacements and command posts out of solid coral with picks and shovels, while the civilian contractors worked alongside them with proper heavy equipment. His men resented him for it. Within weeks, that same relentlessness would be the reason some of them were still alive. On the morning of December 8, 1941, Wake Island time, though it was still December 7th back in Hawaii, on the other side of the international date line, the men on the atoll got word of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had perhaps 3 hours to prepare before 36 Japanese bombers, flying from bases in the Marshall Islands, appeared over the island in clear weather with no radar to warn them. In minutes, 8 of the 12 Wildcats were destroyed on the ground. Nearly 2/3 of VMF 211's aviation personnel were killed or wounded in the first raid alone. The squadron that had arrived 4 days earlier with 12 fighters now had 4. The bombing didn't stop. For the next several days, Japanese aircraft returned again and again, hitting the airfield, the gun positions, anything that moved. And still, the 4 remaining Wildcats kept flying. On December 10th, Captain Henry Elrod shot down 2 Japanese bombers in a single sortie, a remarkable feat for a pilot flying a fighter that, outnumbering odds and mechanical wear, had already pushed to its limits. By this point, the line between military and civilian on Wake had almost disappeared. Of the roughly 1,200 Morrison-Knudsen construction workers on the atoll, close to 200 volunteered to fight outright, loading ammunition, crewing machine guns, and standing watch alongside Marines they'd been building barracks for a week earlier. Hundreds more supported the defense without ever picking up a rifle, digging bomb shelters by hand, hauling water, and carrying hot food out to gun crews who hadn't left their positions in days. Nobody had trained these men for combat. Nobody had to ask them twice either. Then, on December 11th, Japan tried to finish the job on the ground. A Japanese invasion force under Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka approached the island. Cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports moving in to land Special Naval Landing Force troops on Wake's beaches. Major Devereux made a decision that would define the battle. He ordered his gunners to hold their fire completely, even as the Japanese ships closed to within point-blank range, hoping the enemy would believe the island's coastal defenses had already been destroyed by the earlier air raids. It worked. When the Japanese destroyer Yubari and its escorts had closed to roughly 4,500 yards, well within range of Wake's 5-inch guns, Devereux gave the order. In minutes, Marine gunners scored a direct hit on the destroyer Hayate, striking her magazine. She broke apart and sank in seconds, taking her crew with her, the first Japanese warship sunk by American forces in the Second World War. The light cruiser Yubari took repeated hits and turned away. And as the Japanese force retreated, the 4 surviving Wildcats took off and pressed the attack from the air, strafing and dropping small bombs on the fleeing ships. One of those bombs found the destroyer Kisaragi's depth charges. She exploded and went down with her entire crew, roughly 150 men. It was the first time in the Pacific War that a Japanese amphibious invasion had been thrown back before it even reached the shore. It would also be the last time it happened for the rest of the war. Word of the victory reached the American public within days, and in the darkest month of the war so far, after Pearl Harbor, after Guam, after the invasion of the Philippines, Wake Island became a symbol. Newspapers ran a legendary line, supposedly radioed back by the Marines when headquarters asked what they needed. "Send us more Japs." It's one of the most quoted lines to come out of the entire war. It's also, according to Commander Cunningham's own later account, not real. Outgoing coded messages from the island were padded with meaningless filler words to make them harder for Japanese codebreakers to analyze. Somewhere in transmission, the padding "send" and "more Japs" among the nonsense got separated from the real message and mistaken for its actual content. The truth is quieter than the legend, but in some ways it's more impressive. There was no need for a clever one-liner. What the men on Wake Island actually did needed no exaggeration, because Japan was not finished. The failure on December 11th embarrassed the Imperial Japanese Navy, and its response was to stop treating Wake as a minor mopping-up operation. 2 aircraft carriers, the Soryu and the Hiryu, fresh from the Pearl Harbor strike force, were diverted to support a second invasion. More cruisers, more destroyers, and roughly 1,500 additional troops were committed to a target that 10 days earlier planners had assumed would fall in an afternoon. On Wake, the defenders didn't know exactly what was coming, but they knew help might be on the way. On December 20th, A Navy seaplane landed in the lagoon carrying word that a relief expedition, built around the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, was steaming toward the island, expected to arrive around Christmas Eve. For a few days, exhausted Marines allowed themselves to believe reinforcement, or at least evacuation, was close. Then, on December 22nd, Pacific Fleet Headquarters recalled the relief force. The reasoning was caution born of catastrophe. After the losses at Pearl Harbor, commanders were unwilling to risk a carrier group so far from support, especially with Japanese carriers now confirmed in the area. The men on Wake Island were never told. They kept watching the horizon for ships that had already turned around. The second invasion came before dawn on December 23rd. Two old Japanese destroyers, converted into makeshift landing craft, ran themselves deliberately aground on Wake's Reef to put troops ashore as fast as possible. Roughly 1,500 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops stormed the beaches under covering fire from the ships and aircraft offshore. This time, there was no ambush to spring. The numbers were simply too lopsided. Grounded pilots and ground crews from VMF 211, out of aircraft and out of options, picked up rifles and fought as infantry alongside the Marines. Captain Henry Elrod was among them. Having already shot down 2 bombers and helped sink a destroyer, he spent his final hours on the ground organizing a defensive position and, according to multiple accounts, personally destroying enemy machine gun positions before he was killed in the fighting. He would later become the first Marine aviator awarded the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. The fighting lasted roughly 11 hours. Communication between American strongpoints broke down as Japanese troops cut the field telephone lines. Isolated pockets of Marines, sailors, and armed civilian contractors held their positions with no way of knowing whether the men fighting a few hundred yards away were still alive, or whether the rest of the island had already fallen. On Wilkes Island, a separate Marine detachment, cut off entirely from Devereux's command post, fought its own battle and destroyed a Japanese landing party without any idea that the main garrison was on the verge of surrender. Near the airfield, small groups of Marines and armed civilians held ground against SNLF troops, advancing in numbers that made the outcome, in retrospect, never really in doubt. It wasn't a lack of fight that decided the battle. It was arithmetic. 1,500 fresh troops, backed by warships and carrier aircraft, against a garrison that had already been bombed for 16 straight days. By late morning, with Japanese troops controlling large sections of the island, no communication between commands, and no possibility of relief, Commander Cunningham made the decision no commander wants to make. He later said simply that there was nothing left to buy with more lives. He ordered the surrender. The cost, on both sides, was steep for a battle fought on a speck of coral most Americans had never heard of before December 1941. Roughly 49 Marines, 3 sailors, and around 70 civilians were killed defending the island. Japan's losses were far heavier. 2 destroyers sunk, a submarine sunk during the siege, several other ships damaged, more than 20 aircraft shot down, and somewhere between 700 and 1,000 men killed, by far the most costly Japanese amphibious operation of the war's opening weeks. For the roughly 1,600 Americans taken prisoner, Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors alike, the war was far from over. Most were shipped to prisoner-of-war camps in Japan and occupied China in early 1942, where they would spend nearly 4 brutal years in captivity. 98 civilian contractors, however, were kept behind on Wake itself, forced to labor building fortifications for a Japanese garrison, bracing for an American invasion that, due to the U.S. Navy's island-hopping strategy, would never actually come. In October 1943, after American carrier aircraft bombed the island heavily, the Japanese garrison commander, Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara convinced himself the bombing was the prelude to an invasion and that the 98 remaining prisoners posed a security risk. On October 7, 1943, he ordered them marched to the northern end of the island and executed. One prisoner, whose name has never been identified, escaped the killing, made his way back to the burial site, and carved a message into a block of coral before being recaptured. 98 USPW, May 10, 43. That rock still exists on Wake Island today. After the war, Sakaibara was tried for war crimes, convicted, and hanged on Guam in 1947. Wake Island itself remained in Japanese hands for the rest of the war. Bypassed and blockaded rather than invaded, its garrison slowly starved of supplies until Japan's formal surrender in September 1945. None of this changed the outcome of the Pacific War. 16 days on a coral atoll didn't sink a single Japanese aircraft carrier or turn back an invasion fleet bound for anywhere else. Strategically, Wake Island was a loss, and it stayed a loss for the next 3.5 years. But strategy isn't the only thing a battle can decide. In a month when the United States had almost nothing to point to except loss after loss, Pearl Harbor, Guam, the opening disasters in the Philippines, 449 Marines, 68 sailors, and more than 1,000 civilian construction workers who had never been trained to fight, gave the country something it desperately needed: proof that Americans, badly outnumbered and completely alone, would still stand. It's worth sitting with what that actually cost. The men who held the line on December 11th spent the next 4 years as prisoners of war, most of them in brutal conditions in Japan and occupied China. The 98 who stayed behind on Wake never came home at all. Devereux and Cunningham survived captivity and lived to see the men who murdered their people brought to trial. Elrod did not survive to receive the medal that bears his name. None of them got to see how the story of Wake Island would be remembered, as a rallying cry, printed on recruiting posters, turned into a wartime film before the real battle had even finished being fought. The legend served a purpose in December 1941, but the men themselves deserve better than a legend. They deserve the real story, told accurately, 16 days at a time. That's not a footnote, it's what actually happened. If you want to see exactly how a single garrison held off an empire for 16 days with almost nothing, and what happened to the men who survived it, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.